Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to combine die cuts with printed papers using the new Whimsical Skies collection from Spellbinders. We have the Whimsical Houses die set as well as the Whimsical Blooms die set. Lots of different choices in that set. Then we have the Village Companion set, perfect to go with those houses as well as other collections. And we have the Whimsical Skies embossing folder to create a really unique swirly background. I'm going to create 4 cards total, and for 3 of the cards I'm going to be using sentiments from this Welcome Home sentiment press plate and die set. For the other card I'm going to be using the layered Get Well Soon die set. So I'm going to put all of the sentiments from this set on the base of my BetterPress system. I haven't chosen which ones I want to use. I'll just choose them as I'm creating, and any extra ones that I'll make, I'll just put them in a Ziploc bag in that package and I'll use them for future projects. So I'm going to heat emboss my sentiment. So I put a bit of embossing powder tool on my cardstock. I'm just using some hammer mill cardstock here. And then I inked my press plates with Versamark ink, put the clear plate onto the base of the BetterPress system, and then ran it through my die cutting machine to press those sentiments onto that cardstock. Then I can put that onto a piece of scrap paper and pour embossing powder on top of it. Here I'm using some silver embossing powder, and I do like to use super fine embossing powder when possible, especially with BetterPress sentiments, because that sentiment gets pressed into that cardstock and there's a lot of fine detail. I do think you get a better finish with using super fine embossing powder. If I don't happen to have super fine in a particular color that I want to use, I'll just use regular, but anytime it's available, I do choose the super fine. So once I have the powder on there, I tap off the excess and then use my embossing tool to melt that powder onto the cardstock. Then we're going to use the coordinating dies in this set and cut out all of those sentiments. So I'm going to match each one of those sentiments with the coordinating dies and use a little bit of Best Ever craft tape in order to tape that die in place. That way, and when I'm doing my die cutting, I know that that die is going to stay exactly where I put it. It's not going to move and shift on me. And the dies are really easy to lay out and line up with those sentiments. So I actually end up die cutting all but one of the sentiments. One of the dies was going to overlap a different die. Anytime you're die cutting a bunch of stuff at once, you don't want any of those dies to overlap. So I die cut most of them, then did that last piece or that last sentiment die cut all by itself. Once I have them die cut, I'm just going to set all of those sentiments off to the side. Like I said, I'm going to be using 3 of them for the cards that I'm creating. The rest of them, I'll just put back in the package with that die set, and it'll be used for a future project. To add a little bit of interest to my cards, I'm going to be using the printed papers from the Breakfast in Bed 6-inch paper pad. For my first 2 cards, I'm going to be using the floral die cuts from the Whimsical Blooms die set, but I'm going to be using floral printed papers from that Breakfast in Bed pack for the mats around my card. So they're going to give some color inspiration for the florals that I'm going to be using. I just thought it would maybe look a little bit interesting to have florals as the mat. Now I'm also going to be using the floral printed papers for one of my house cards as well as the mats for those, because those houses just made me think of those colorful houses in Nova Scotia, and I wanted to emulate that, and I thought it'd be really fun to do it with some printed papers, but we'll get to that later. So for the first card here, I'm using this one flower. I've got it die cut in 2 different colors. I did a little bit of ink blending on it with some abandoned coral distress ink as well as seedless preserves. Then I assembled it together and I used some Barely art glue in a fine line bottle. I love to use liquid glue when assembling because it gives you that little bit of wiggle room to move and shimmy it in place. For the main part of my card here, I'm embossing it with that Whimsical Skies embossing folder, trimming it down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches before using that Seedless Preserves Distress ink to just do a little bit of light ink blending around the outside. I wanted to just add a color to this to highlight the embossing and the texture, but I didn't want to completely cover it in color. You could also cover it in color and do like an embossed, like an ombre background. That would look fabulous as well, but I wanted those florals to be on a mostly white background. So here is the printed paper that I chose for this card. That is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And like I said, my embossed piece is trimmed down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. So we just get a hint of that floral behind our main embossed piece. Then we can add the florals to the front, and these have really long stems to them. So I am going to be doing them in kind of a crisscross pattern, so we don't need to cut off the stems, but you certainly could. If you wanted to shorten them a little bit, you could always take a pair of scissors and trim them down just a little bit. I also did some ink blending on my sentiment for this card using the Seedless Preserves, so it coordinates with one of the flowers as well as the color that was used to ink blend around the outside edges. So a super simple card, but that floral die cut itself is very, very unique. For the next card, I'm going to be using other florals from that die set that I didn't use in the first card. So for this first floral here, this one's a little bit larger than the other ones that I'm using. I have it die cut out of some tutu cardstock or blush cardstock, and I'm just using some Kitsch Flamingo Distress ink just to add a little bit of visual dimension to the base of the flower. Then I have the center die cut out of tutu cardstock, and I'm just going to glue them on there while I have it on my sticky mat. I let that dry for a few moments, and then we're ready to start assembling our cards. And they're super easy to put together, just with a little bit of liquid glue and then put the pieces on top. For these other flowers here, I just put the glue on the stem and use my wax tip tool from the handy tool set in order to lift up the die cuts and just place them where they're supposed to go. I do lay out my die cuts on my surface kind of in order of how they're supposed to go so that I can see everything and know where everything is. It makes it so much easier for the assembly that I know that I have all the pieces I need and they're ready to go, easy at hand right there. Now, this is the card that I'm going to be doing the layered Get Well Soon sentiment. I did die cut that out of some printed cardstock as well from that Breakfast in Bed 6-inch paper pack in order to give it just a little bit of a unique look and coordinate with the mat on this card. Once again, I'm using the Whimsical Skies embossing folder for my background. It's just embossed with white cardstock, and then I'm going to trim it down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches and use some Twisted Citron Distress ink on the back just to add a little bit of color there. Another option again would be to say use a brayer and just use the color on top of the embossed background, or you could even just leave it completely white if you wanted to. So there's many different options and many different techniques for using embossing folders. You can also use ink right onto the embossing folder, and that's what I do often when I'm embossing. But for these, I wanted the focal point to be the die cuts on the background. So I'm going to start assembling this card because we have all our pieces ready to go. So I'm going to start with that printed paper onto my A2 card base. I use that same liquid glue to glue and assemble my large pieces for my cards as well. I love that it works perfectly for those large pieces as well as the tiny die cuts. Once I have my background on there, we can start adding the die cuts. And I'm going to have them a little bit off-centered on my card. So they're a little bit to the left. When I go to finish my card, I'm going to be finishing it off with that Get Well Soon layered sentiment. And that's going to be off to the right a little bit. It is going to be overlapping some of the stems, so they're going to be connected, but that will balance it out. We'll have the florals to the left, the sentiment to the right. So once I have that on there, and I am generous with my adhesive when I'm gluing it on top of an embossed background, because there's a lot of areas that are raised and recessed, I want to make sure that the glue has good contact with it. To add just a touch of sparkle to these florals, I'm going to use a little bit of Stickles. This is an iridescent Stickles, so it'll show the color of the cardstock through there. It's just going to add a little bit of texture as well as a little bit of sparkle to those die cuts. So my last two cards are going to be using the Whimsical Houses die. This card here, we're just going to use one of the houses, and then my second card for the houses, we're going to do 3 houses all on one card. So I take all of my die cuts, lay them out, like I said before, I typically will lay them out similar to how they are assembled. So like the roof will be close to the top of the house die cut, so it's easy to grab. I know where everything is. As I'm assembling, obviously there's less pieces on my desk, so it'll be easier and easier as they get assembled because they're all attached and it's a little bit less chaotic. Sometimes for beginners, when you have die cuts that have a lot of different pieces to it, it can get overwhelming. So this to me is the best way to avoid that by having everything out. You can see it as you're attaching it. You know where everything goes. You'll have less and less die cuts. The great thing about pieces that have a lot of die cuts to them is they have a lot of detail to them, and the finish result of them has a lot more impact because they're a little bit more impressive. So once my house is done, I assembled the fence, then I'm assembling the sun. Then I can add the nose to the dog, and that dog is die cut out of velvet cardstock, so it has some extra texture to it. It's got a fuzzy surface to it. I will often do animals and stuff like that with velvet cardstock because I love the extra texture it gives. For the next card, there's also a cat in the Village Companions die set, so I'm going to be using that on the next one, and that's done with velvet cardstock as well. To add a little bit of metallic shine, I'm using the Lisa Horton silver pad just to do a little bit of ink blending on the bottom of the clouds. It ended up being a lot of ink blending because I forgot that I had re-inked my pad last time I used it, so I was anticipating that there not being as much ink on my brush, and there ended up being a lot, but that's totally fine. For the background for this card, I have embossed it and I've trimmed it down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. And I'm taking that same pad and I'm just lightly brushing it over my embossed background. It's only going to ink the raised surface, so it's going to really bring out the pattern on that embossed background. I thought it would be fun to use one of the floral papers that have smaller pattern to it to kind of create a border that almost looks like a garden of flowers. So I also have a border here of green for the grass. I've just ripped the edges to give it a bit more of an organic look and a little bit, so it's not die cut. For some cards, I just like that different look that it gives it. Then I put it onto my background and then I can trim it down to size. It's much easier sometimes, especially for borders like that, to place it exactly how you want, to have it a little bit longer and then trim it down afterwards. Once we have our base down there, we can add our house, our fence, and then we can add the dog. We can also finish off the sun and the clouds in the sky. Now, I only did the 3 clouds that are in that Village Companions die set. You obviously could do a whole lot more if you wanted to fill that background in with clouds. Now, I kept my background white and embossed it, but you could, if you wanted, use a variety of different blue cardstocks if you wanted to have it a little bit more colored. To add a little bit of contrast to that sky, my cloud die cuts are die cut out of fog cardstock, so you see them really well on top of that white cardstock, so they don't just blend into that background. Once I have everything glued on, I let them dry for a few moments, and then I flip that piece over and trim off the excess of our grass and flower border, and now we can add everything to our A2 card base. So first we're adding that printed paper, and this one's a little bit more subtle because we have a lot more on the front of the card, a lot more colors. So that is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. Our embossed background is trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. And once we have everything on there, I'm taking one of the sentiments that we embossed from the Welcome Home sentiment set, and I'm just adding that to the bottom right of the card. To add just a little bit more texture, I'm using some glossy accents on the window of the house. Now, there are dividers, obviously, on that window. You can see them. I end up going over top of them. So I just go on the center of the house, over top of that crisscross, simply because some of those areas were a little bit smaller and my glossy accents were flowing out of my jar really quickly, and I didn't have enough control to just put it in those openings for this particular card. But I do repeat the same thing for the next card because I wanted both of them to be the same. So you can, if you want, just put that glossy accents in just those window openings. Another option would be to use a piece of acetate underneath that window die cut in the openings of our printed house. So then you have that gloss and that shine from the windows instead of doing the glossy accents. So there's a few different ways to do that. For the third card here, like I said before, I'm using some of the printed papers from the Breakfast in Bed printed paper pack. I chose ones that had smaller prints to them, just so that you could see the print on the house. But I think it just gives, because these houses have such a unique look to them anyways, I think the printed papers are just a fun way to really have fun with those die cuts. So for the houses, there is an outline die for them, and then there's also an inside insert that cuts out those window pieces. So I did one die cut with just white cardstock for the background, and then one with the printed paper using that insert so that we have those window die cuts out of there. Now I just did that background with white cardstock, but if you want to have a different color in your windows, you could use a different color of cardstock there. I chose some anchor cardstock for the roofs as well as our windows and doors, so that we have something that's a little bit different from the printed papers, but it's not quite so dark and stark and contrasting as black cardstock. Once I have the front to the base, the printed paper to the base, we can add those roofs. And then for the windows themselves, I just put a line of glue on the inside window opening. Then I add the window itself using that handy tool to lift it and push it in place. Like I said, with the white glue, it gives you that little bit of wiggle room to move and shimmy it in place, or like I just did there, if you happen to put a window upside down, it gives you that ability to change it right away and to correct it right away. Just like my last card, I'm going to use that silver on the bottom of the clouds. This time though, I'm not inking my brush up anymore. I've got enough ink on that brush, so it's a little bit more subtle than the last card. I'm going to do the background the same though. I'm going to emboss it with that Whimsical Skies embossing folder, and then I'm going to use that silver pad, just running it over top of that embossed background to highlight the texture of those clouds. Another option here would be to just use a gray pad if you didn't really want to have that metallic to the background, but I opted to keep it on there because I just like the different finishes when I'm creating. I always love having different finishes. I think it just makes something a little bit more interesting. But if silver on the clouds is a little bit too flashy for you, you can easily just change that to gray cardstock and it will look fabulous as well. Another option would be to use white cardstock, tape it in your embossing folder, and then ink up your embossing folder with whatever color you want, whether it's blue or gray, so that the recessed areas of your embossed background have that color and the raised areas are just the white of the cardstock. So once we have all of our pieces ready, we're ready to start assembling them. So I put the printed paper on my A2 card base, then the embossed cardstock that was once again trimmed down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. And then we're adding the houses. So I started with the one in the center, and then I add the 2 to the side. That way I can just kind of get the spacing a little bit more even because we have that one in the center then. Then I'm going to add the sun to the sky and then add those clouds there. Now, you could easily take the sentiment and put it on the inside of the card if you want. I'm going to leave it in the sky where there's a little bit of open space, but you could also take it and put it on the inside of the card if you didn't want to cover any space. So the last step is adding that cat. And like I said before, that cat is done with velvet cardstock as well. That velvet cardstock has adhesive on the back of it. So I typically put that adhesive on some scrap paper and then I do my die cutting. It die cuts just like regular cardstock. There's no difference in the actual die cutting process, but it just adds that extra little bit of texture. The last step is putting those glossy accents in the windows, just like the last card. And this time I put some stickles on the sun as well, just to add a little bit of sparkle. Then I'm going to let that completely dry. I just love the whimsical look of these houses. I think they're just so fun. I did them here on 2 cards, but you could easily do them on a scrapbook page. I think it would be fun on like a mixed media project or like a junk journal type page. Just something different, something unique, something interesting. And I did them with printed papers here, but you could easily just use solid cardstocks with them and have fun with them that way. Then we have our other 2 cards with those florals. I just love the variety of really unique florals in this. You can find everything that I've used listed and linked down in the description below. So if there's something that I may not have mentioned, you might find the information down there. Otherwise, you can just comment and I will answer it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spent with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.